To solve the mysteries of consciousness, some scientists recruit the mysteries of quantum physics. I visit quantum popularizer
I don't know
Fred
about this
Alan
guy.
Wolf.
I mean,
Though
I'm
few
not
quantum
familiar
physicists
with
take
him
his
outside of this video.
speculation seriously, Fred is undaunted. Fred, working particularly in quantum mechanics, do you see consciousness as something that's built up from the more fundamental things of brain function and then kind of emerging? Or is consciousness something that is fundamental and irreducible in itself?
It's fundamental and irreducible. There's no way that you're going to build it up. It's just like having the proton or even the quark and trying to find everything based upon it being the fundamental when the quantum field is really the fundamental, which is an invisible thing. It's the same question. The things that consciousness does are the things that we call normal awareness of whatever it is. But it itself is difficult to contemplate as it itself because it's not a thing in of itself. It's not limited by space or time. We can see more of it, but not actually see it when we go down at the level of the quantum field, which is not a material thing.
It would seem that the burden of proof...
I think that, like I say, I don't know his work, but I think he does make a good point. Part of the problem with consciousness is that you can't really study it in the normal ways. You can't see a consciousness. You can't count consciousness as brains, yeah. And so that's why so many scientists and materialists, they just really, really want to find, to forget about raw consciousness itself and work with perceptually visible correlates. And then even those scientists who are explicitly working on consciousness, you look at what they say and how they're doing things, and oftentimes just getting rid of the raw subjectivity itself is the first thing they do because their methodologies just can't handle it. That's what I hear. What was his name? Wolf saying that, and it's an important point.
Is on you because neuroscientists can show very strong correlations. Some would even go to causation between activities in the brain and our sensory, visual, auditory, motor. What you're talking about is kind of ethereal.
Well, it may be ethereal, but if you actually ask materialists how they can prove from whatever they look at that there's a willful intent operating in that body, if you can find their way of proving that, then I would agree with them, but they can't.
So one of the tests that you're using is willful intent. How do you have willful intent in a purely materialistic world?
You don't. You can't unless it's a machine. And we're not machines because we're shapers of possibilities into realities. That's what quantum physics predicts. It predicts that a mind or something, an observer, which is not material, shapes materiality.
So what are the implications of that? Is then willful intent wherever
Although
it occurs?
keep in mind that there's a lot of interpretations of quantum mechanics, and a lot of people try to avoid what he just said. I'm, of course, kind of on his side, although, I mean, I don't know enough about quantum mechanics to say that with authority, but I'm really interested in quantum consciousness, and I think it's an important avenue of study.
The critical factor in giving us this sense that consciousness is a real, independent, irreducible part of the world?
I think it is. And it is now, I think, of an interest if willful intent can be discovered in any materialistic way. But I don't think it can because there's this process in quantum physics where we can't mathematize. We can't put it in a machine and make it work. We can't really see how it is that we shape possibilities, compact the wave function or collapse the wave function. We can't see that process in any kind of material way.
Is there anything else other than willful intent which gives robustness?
It's not quite right as far as not being able to do it in a material way because things like, there's just a lot of different interpretations. Like many worlds theory would say, well, it is very physical. The only thing you have to wrap your head around is that the physical world is exponentially blossoming out into an infinite number of parallel realities. But if you're okay with that, you get to keep your material world. I was going to say, as far as what he's saying is willful intent, I'm not sure that Deepak would actually agree that willful intent, or Donald Hoffman, that willful intent is a low-level characteristic. It's always like, is it this a low-level characteristic of consciousness, or is it just another content of consciousness popping up? And that's not always easy to filter out and decide.
And actualizes this concept of consciousness.
The necessity of there being an abstract world prior to a material world. That if we try to explain everything in terms of a material world, we end up losing a lot of stuff that we can't explain. Whereas if we assume there is an
all
abstract
subjectivity, I agree with him
mental
that.
world, the material world suddenly becomes more explainable. I have to go back to the whole vision of the Platonic
Materialists always have
universe.
such a
It's
problem
there
dealing
that I
with
think we are being
beauty
led.
and
The
dealing
reason
with
I see that
justice,
is that each of us has
dealing
a
with
sense
subjectivity. They always reduce
of
it to
what's
brain, but
beyond
then
the
they
blur
destroy
of our
it, and
own
then
particular way of
they
seeing.
pretend that they didn't.
In other words, we each have a Platonic ideal, and I believe that can only come because the Platonic world is the real world.
Yeah, I don't.
Fred
I mean, I've studied
physics, but then
Plato a little bit in
deeper
college,
reality,
but I don't have much
rooted
to
in
say about that.
consciousness, or even in an abstract Platonic world. Quantum physics does indeed manifest strange traits, but building a world edifice on this shaky foundation seems at best premature.
Now that seems like a
I
weird
might
statement.
like
building your universe based on quantum mechanics is shaky.
reality to be remystified, which is why I should hear the critics. I meet a physicist known for his
I love him for his
unconventional
balance. I just
ideas,
wish
all based on his
Robert
belief
gave
that
the
laws of
idealism
physics,
and
not
panpsychism more
consciousness,
serious.
is ultimate reality.
Even in the one episode
Frank
about it,
Tipler.
he spends half of it
Some
with
philosophers
skeptics.
have taken that concept of consciousness.
Oh, wait a minute. I didn't
and
get this
made it
guy's name.
fundamental
I'm going to go
quantum
backwards for a
physics,
second.
but then I might like reality to be remystified, which is why I should hear the critics.
Yeah, man, just...
I meet a physicist known for his unconventional
You can do it. It can be
ideas,
remystified.
all based on his
You
belief
just have
that
to
the
be willing to
laws
do
of
it.
Physics, not consciousness, is ultimate reality. Frank Tipler. Some philosophers
Frank Tipler.
have taken that concept of consciousness and made it fundamental to the universe.
I think that's fundamentally misconceived. I think that all of reality, human beings, everything that goes to make us up is fully subject to physical law. The human soul exists, and it's immaterial, but it's a computer program. You should think of the human mind, the human soul, the human consciousness as the result of a computer program being run on a wet computer, which is called the human brain. That we can actually quantify thoughts using the same language that we use for information theory. So there is nothing in the human consciousness that is outside the laws of physics and not fully capable of being described in complete detail by the laws of physics.
So that means that consciousness, our
Man.
sense of soul, or
He's just stating ideology that's not even true. The whole point of the hard problem of consciousness is that the color of red, even if you have the frequency, you might have the frequency of light that correlates to red, and you might have the brain information for the correlates for what happens when somebody sees red, but why should it be red, right? That's the whole point of the question, and like he's just ignoring it, in my opinion, and
personal
then stating
awareness
ideology.
is not only derivative from the laws of physics, but in essence, it's no different than a chair, which is also derived from the laws of physics.
It's not quite like a chair. It's more like a word processing program. Now, it's real. It's immaterial, but it's still real. But what is that program? It's just a pattern on a CD. A blank CD, a CD, it's still the same atoms. What has changed, what has made a word processing program valuable, why you have to pay for it, is the change in the pattern of the atoms on the CD. But notice the pattern is immaterial. The pattern is rearranging the atoms rather than the
Robert
atoms
gets him on
itself.
that.
The atoms are the matter. The pattern is truly immaterial. The soul is the
That's a
same
matter of
thing.
opinion.
The term
What-
immaterial,
well,
not
Robert's
in the
got
sense
some
of
here.
non-physical, but in terms of something imposed on the matter or a pattern of the matter, but it is the matter
Exactly.
itself. It's not.
That's an interesting philosophic thing. That does a pattern, is it a pattern in the world, does that count as a material thing, or is it an immaterial thing? He says it's an immaterial thing, so he's sort of a computer dualist, sort of. But a lot of people say, well, no, a pattern, sort of semantic, is a pattern in physicalness, does that count as physical? He says no, other people say yes.
Non-physical.
Well, the laws of thermodynamics, the first two laws, the first one says conservation of energy. That applies to matter, to the material. We also have the second law of thermodynamics, which involves a concept called entropy. Entropy is the same sort of stuff as the soul. It is a law which governs pattern creation. So here you have, in the laws of physics, distinction between body and soul. The first law of thermodynamics concerns the body, concerns matter, concerns energy. The second law of thermodynamics controls information, controls pattern generation, controls and describes the spiritual world. The spiritual world is real, and it's there already in the physics.
All right, so I don't know. He seems like a good guy, but I don't hear him. The idea that you can use information, well, here's how I suppose, is you can use information science to study brain patterns, and those brain patterns correlate to the contents of consciousness. That's interesting. But I don't hear him dealing with raw subjectivity, and this is one of the tricks that materialists use, is they sweep raw subjectivity under the table, and then they bring forth and they're like, oh, check this out, it's this other thing, it's this thing that I can study, but is it the same thing? Like, you can't talk about consciousness without talking about raw subjectivity. And I think if you're talking about computation and information science and these patterns in the brain, and even patterns in thought, yeah, you're talking about everything that can happen in a zombie world. You're not talking about the raw actual experience, you're avoiding it.
To Frank, consciousness is derivative. Only the laws of physics are fundamental. In fact, Frank almost deifies physics, as if God were another name for physical laws. I like his creativity and his courage, if not his conclusion. Conventional science offers no
It is
convincing
important
evidence
to note that
consciousness is
the
ultimate
idea that
reality.
consciousness can be reduced to
If I'm
computation
still in
is
this
popular.
game, I need to go unconventional.
And computation is probably,
Parapsychology claims
part of
that
it.
realities exist beyond the physical. I meet one of parapsychology's pioneers, Charles Tart. Charlie, as a psychologist who focuses on data, some unusual data to be sure, how do you view this question about the irreducible nature of consciousness?
I view it through the lens.
Let me just add, this is one of the things I like so much about Robert. I'm into parapsychology. Robert obviously isn't, but he gives these guys respect, like Tart. He gives them real respect and puts them on his show, and it's really good. And that's one of the things that makes Robert so great.
Of asking how useful is the question? What will different kinds of answers to the question lead you to do, and what might you learn from that? If you view it as fundamental, which is my preference, then you're going to ask questions about consciousness and do research on it that you wouldn't do otherwise. If you make consciousness fundamental, then it becomes very interesting to ask questions like, why don't we experience telepathic contact with each other all the time? Why do we feel separate? Is it simply because consciousness is so focused on a particular physical body and brain that it's ignoring all the other telepathic impressions?
And can we make progress on that? Because if we can't, then maybe consciousness
That's,
is
of
not
course, assuming that you
fundamental,
buy
and it
the
is reducible to
parapsychological
brain
data.
functional
I
law.
do,
If
at least to a certain
consciousness can be
degree, but a
something
lot of
other
folks
than
don't.
the brain and still not be fundamental, it could be derived from something else.
Then let's find out what that is.
Is that possible in principle? Because maybe if we're dealing in the physical world of physical experiments and data, that in principle, those kinds of things, if they exist, are not susceptible to the kinds of observations that we make in the physical world.
When you ask an ultimate question like that, Robert, I'm reminded of something that John Lilly once put very nicely. Something like, in the realm of the mind, what one believes to be true tends to become true. So the moral of all that is be careful what you believe. If you believe in certain kind of limits, your mind may create those limits for you. If you don't, it may not. Try it both ways and see what happens.
Well,
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think most people agree that your beliefs affect your life deeply. Then it becomes a point of contention, though. That how deep is it? Is it surface level that your beliefs trick you into believing things that aren't really real, or is it more like your beliefs are really affecting reality itself, or maybe it's somewhere in between?
I would put that almost in reverse, that because I have a desire for consciousness to be fundamental, I'm going to spend more time and think about it and talk about it. Maybe I'm just fooling myself.
Maybe, but what's the alternative?
I'm not quite sure what he means.
The alternative is to face reality and to look at the scientific data, and if the scientific data doesn't support it, put your efforts into things that make sense and not into nonsense.
I'm an experimentalist, I'm a pragmatist. I say try different approaches and see what comes of them and see where it takes you. If you go down some dead ends, that's fine. You learn from the dead ends. If you go to interesting new places, wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I like how Robert pushes people without being disrespectful, but it does kind of like, he is a little bit like, maybe you should quit wasting your life on all this bullshit. And then Tart is like, well, I'm just one person, and somebody's got to go down this road. And I think it's a reasonable answer, but it's a little unfair to say, oh, face reality. Figuring out reality is the whole point, man. Like, facing reality. There is no just face reality when it's the nature of reality is what we're already trying to figure out.